Maria survived one of history's most calculated genocides. For 70 years, 4 simple words,
"Mom, I want to eat,"
have haunted her dreams. Now, she's ready to reveal how Stalin starved 3.9 million Ukrainians, including 8 of her 10 siblings, without firing a single shot. She'll show you what tree bark tastes like when it's all that's left, and why those
"Whispered, please,"
from dying children still feel sharper than any knife.
I'm Maria, and I still hear those words echoing in my mind 70 years later.
"Mom, I want to eat."
My youngest brother whispered them until his voice faded to nothing, and I watched him slip away while I had absolutely nothing to give him. If you've ever felt helpless, you'll understand what Stalin did to Ukraine in 1933 wasn't just starvation, it was calculated murder. They called it the Holodomor, combining the Ukrainian words for hunger and extermination, and it took 3.9 million lives. But the worst part? We weren't allowed to talk about it for decades. What I'm about to tell you has stayed buried in silence for too long. The sound that haunts me. I need you to understand something. There's a sound that never leaves you, and it's not what you think. When children starve, their voices change in ways that burrow into your soul and stay there forever. In the beginning, during those first weeks when the grain disappeared from our village, my 7-year-old brother Petro would ask for food with his normal voice, bright and expectant like any child asking for a snack. But as the days stretched into months, I watched his voice transform into something that still makes my hands shake when I remember it. The strong, clear tones that used to fill our small house with laughter gradually became thinner, more strained, until each word he spoke sounded like it was being dragged through broken glass. By December of 1932, when the snow covered the bodies that had started appearing in our streets, Petro's voice had become a whisper. "Mama, I want to eat," he would say, and the words came out so soft I had to lean close to his mouth to hear them. His breath felt cold against my ear, and I could smell the sickness that hunger brings, that sweet, rotten smell that clings to people when their bodies start consuming themselves. We had tried eating famine foods like leaves and grass documented by survivors, but they only made the smell worse. I would stroke his hair, feeling how thin it had become, and I would lie to him the way every parent learned to lie during those months. "Tomorrow, Petro," I would whisper back. "Papa will bring bread tomorrow." But tomorrow never came, and the lies became heavier each time they left my mouth. The psychological torture of hearing those 4 words, "Mama, I want to eat," dozens of times each day broke something inside me that never healed. Petra would repeat them like a prayer, sitting on our kitchen floor where the table used to be before we burned it for warmth. I started counting them, which I realize now was my mind's way of trying to control something that had no control. 37 times on a Tuesday, 42 times on a Wednesday. The numbers became more real to me than the words themselves, because the words had stopped meaning anything except pain. I witnessed other mothers also torn between their love and pain, trying silence or distance to survive the sound. The worst part was knowing that every time Petro said those words, he was using energy he didn't have. Speaking required calories his body had already burned through, and I could see how each sentence cost him more than he could afford to spend. His lips started cracking from the effort of forming words, and sometimes tiny drops of blood would appear at the corners of his mouth after he talked. I wanted to tell him to stop speaking, to save his strength, but I also knew that asking for food was the only thing that still connected him to hope, to the belief that maybe this time I would have an answer that wasn't another lie. Then came the morning in February when the begging stopped. I woke up expecting to hear Petro's voice because it had become my alarm clock, the sound that told me another day of searching for food had begun. But the house was quiet except for the wind rattling our broken windows. I found him sitting in the corner where he always sat, his back against the wall, his eyes open, and looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. His mouth moved like he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. He had reached the point where his body couldn't spare the energy for words anymore, not even whispered ones. That silence was somehow worse than all the crying and begging that had come before it. When children beg for food, at least you know they're still fighting, still hoping. But when they stop begging, when they don't even have the strength left to ask for what they need, you realize you're watching them slip away from you one breath at a time. The last words my youngest brother spoke were not, "Mama, I want to eat." They were something else entirely, something that carved itself into my memory with such precision that I can still hear them exactly as he said them 70 years later. On a Thursday morning in March, when the snow had started to melt and reveal all the bodies that winter had hidden, Petro looked at me with eyes that seemed too big for his face and whispered, "Mama, I'm not hungry anymore." He died that afternoon, and I understood then that loving someone during the Holodomor meant something entirely different than I had ever imagined. When love becomes torture. They say a mother's love knows no bounds, but what happens when that love becomes the source of your deepest agony? I learned the answer during those months when loving my family felt like carrying broken glass in my chest, cutting deeper with every breath. Every parent in our village faced the same impossible choice. Staying meant watching your children waste away in front of you. Leaving meant abandoning them when they needed you most. There was no right answer, no path that didn't lead to torture, and that's what Stalin counted on when he designed this hell for us. Some mothers couldn't bear to witness their children's suffering anymore, so they found ways to escape without actually leaving. Mrs. Petrick, who lived across from us, started hiding behind her own house every morning, crouching in the mud between the chicken coop and the back wall, where she could hear her 3 children crying inside but couldn't see their faces. I watched her through my window, her shoulders shaking as she pressed her back against the wooden boards, and I understood exactly why she did it. Seeing the pain was worse than hearing it, because when you looked into your child's eyes, you saw your own failure reflected back at you. The guilt of eating anything, even a single grain of wheat, while your child starved, created a special kind of torment that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I remember finding a small piece of bread crust in the corner of our neighbor's abandoned house, and when I put it in my mouth, the taste made me physically sick, not because it was spoiled, but because I knew Petro hadn't eaten anything in 3 days. That piece of bread sat in my stomach like a stone, and I spent the rest of the day trying to make myself vomit it back up so I could give it to him instead. But my body wouldn't let go of those few precious calories, and I hated myself for being grateful when it stayed down. Parents would take their own meager rations, sometimes just a few spoonfuls of watery soup made from grass and bark, and give them to their children, watching those precious calories disappear in seconds. I watched my father do this every day, sliding his portion across our wooden floor to where Petro sat, and the boy would drink it so fast that soup would run down his chin. Papa would smile and tell him it was good to see him eat, but I could see how Papa's hands trembled afterward, how his eyes would close like he was in physical pain. We were all slowly killing ourselves to buy our children a few more days, and those extra days just meant more suffering for everyone. By winter, survivors reported stepping over bodies daily in our village streets, and the desperation drove some mothers to consider ending their children's suffering permanently rather than watch them waste away. One survivor testified about a woman in the next village who fired up the oven, put the children to sleep, closed the damper to the chimney, trying to fill their house with smoke so they could all die together peacefully. Her family stopped her just in time, but I understood her thinking completely. When you watch your child's body consume itself, when you see their skin hanging loose and their eyes sinking into their skull, death starts looking like mercy instead of tragedy. Our parental instincts, the very love that was supposed to protect our children, became weapons that Stalin used against us. Every time I looked at Petro, my heart told me to comfort him, to hold him, to promise him everything would be fine. But those promises were lies that made his hope last longer, which meant his suffering lasted longer too. My love for him kept him fighting when it might have been kinder to let him give up. The maternal bond that should have been my strength became the source of my deepest torture, because it forced me to participate in his pain instead of ending it. Fathers often couldn't handle watching their families disintegrate, so they would disappear for days at a time, walking to other villages or just sitting by the river until they couldn't stand to be away any longer. My father started taking these trips in February, leaving before dawn and not coming back until after dark. He would return with empty hands and guilt written across his face. But I knew he wasn't really looking for food during those long absences. He was looking for a place where he couldn't hear us suffering, where the weight of his helplessness wouldn't crush him completely. The choice between hope and mercy became the defining torture of parenthood during the Holodomor. Do you keep telling your child that food is coming, that tomorrow will be better, knowing those lies will keep them alive long enough to suffer more? Or do you tell them the truth, that there is no food coming, that they're going to die, that you can't save them and watch their spirit break along with their body? I chose hope until the very end, and I still don't know if that was the right decision or the cruelest one I ever made. But when even hope became too expensive to maintain, when the last of our stored grain disappeared and winter stretched endlessly ahead of us, we discovered that survival demanded something else entirely. We learned that the human body will accept almost anything when the alternative is death, and that desperation has its own bitter flavor that never leaves your mouth. The things we ate when food disappeared. You think you know hunger, but let me tell you what desperation actually tastes like. When the grain disappeared from our village in late 1932, we started with what most people would consider normal rationing, cutting our bread portions in half, then quarters, then into crumbs so small you could count them on your fingers. But hunger doesn't stop when the bread runs out, and your stomach doesn't care that there's nothing left in the cupboards. That's when we learned that the human body will accept almost anything if you're desperate enough, and your mind will convince you that tree bark tastes like food if the alternative is death. We tried 72 different famine foods, from acacia blossoms to dock leaves, often trading stomach cramps for a few hours of fullness. We experimented on ourselves, eating roots that made us sicker but fooled our hunger. We started with things that seemed reasonable, nettles and dock leaves that we boiled until they turned into green mush, acacia blossoms that we called kashkas, and mixed with whatever liquid we could find. But as winter stretched on and even these plants disappeared under the snow, we moved to things that made us sicker instead of better. I saw families doubled over with stomach cramps after eating certain roots, their faces gray with pain, but they kept eating them anyway because the feeling of fullness, even painful fullness, was better than the hollow ache of complete emptiness. Tree bark became our daily bread, and I can still taste the bitter, woody flavor that coated my tongue for months. We would strip it from birch and oak trees, boil it for hours until it softened enough to chew, then strain the liquid into something we called soup. The texture felt like wet cardboard in your mouth, fibrous and resistant, and it would stick between your teeth in ways that reminded you constantly of what you were reduced to eating. Sometimes I would find myself chewing the same piece of bark for 10 minutes, trying to extract every possible nutrient until my jaw ached and my saliva turned brown from the tannins. Grass became another staple, though it provided almost no nutrition and often left us feeling hungrier than before we ate it. I learned to identify which types wouldn't kill us immediately. The young shoots that hadn't turned tough yet, certain weeds that grew near our house that didn't make us vomit blood. We would pull handfuls of it from the ground, wash it in whatever water we could find, and chew it raw because we didn't have fuel to cook everything. The taste was bitter and green, like eating the earth itself, and it would sit in your stomach like a lump of clay that never properly digested. When even these plant substitutes started running out in our village, I realized we had crossed into territory that would have been unthinkable just months before. Children began fighting over potato peels like they were diamonds, grabbing them from each other's hands and stuffing them in their mouths before anyone could steal them back. I watched my neighbor's 6-year-old daughter punch her younger brother in the face over a piece of apple core that was mostly brown rot, and instead of scolding her, their mother just looked away because she understood that survival had replaced every other instinct. The desperation drove us to eat things that weren't food by any definition. Clay from the riverbank that we mixed with water to fill our stomachs. Sawdust that we tried to make into bread by adding whatever scraps we could find. The clay absorbed all the moisture in my mouth, and the sawdust scratched my throat going down. But even knowing these things hurt us, we kept eating them because the illusion of fullness was better than facing the reality of complete starvation. Collective farmers started stealing food meant for pigs, mixed fodder that they would bake into flat cakes and eat like it was a delicacy. I knew people who would sneak into barns at night, risking imprisonment or death just to grab handfuls of grain intended for livestock. One woman told me she had eaten field mice and described them as the greatest delicacies, because by that point, cats and dogs had been consumed long ago. Children working in the collective farm fields learned to pull out weeds and eat the young plants, tearing the thick skin from the old ones and eating the soft middle. I watched kids who should have been playing games instead become experts at identifying which plant parts might keep them alive another day. The day I found my neighbor making pancakes from tree leaves for her 10 children changed how I understood human adaptability forever. As documented in testimonies from survivors, she had been doing this for nearly a month, grinding different types of leaves into a paste and cooking them on a hot stone like they were real food. Her children ate these leaf pancakes with the same enthusiasm they once had for actual meals, because their bodies had forgotten what real food tasted like. Watching her flip those green, bitter circles while humming a lullaby made me realize that these survival foods had become more than just desperate measures. They were symbols of our refusal to surrender. But even as we found ways to keep our bodies functioning, the world around us was changing in ways that made eating seem almost pointless. The streets themselves were becoming something else entirely, and walking through our village required navigating obstacles that no human being should ever have to step around. Bodies in the streets. There's something about death that changes when it becomes ordinary. When stepping over bodies becomes part of your daily routine, like checking the weather or feeding chickens. At the famine's height, estimates reached 25,000 deaths daily across Ukraine, and in our small village, that massive number translated into faces I recognized lying motionless in doorways and ditches. The human mind isn't built to process that much death, so it starts treating corpses like furniture, obstacles to navigate around rather than people who once had names and families and dreams. Bodies appeared overnight with the regularity of sunrise, and the shock of recognition never got easier, even when the sight of death itself became routine. I would wake up and look out my window to see the Petrenko family's youngest son curled up against their fence, and I would remember talking to him just 3 days earlier when he asked if I had seen any cats he could catch. His mother found him that morning and didn't even cry, just stood there looking at him with the same expression she used to wear when she was deciding what to cook for dinner, like she was solving a practical problem rather than mourning her child. The smell hit you first, even in the cold weather, a sweet and rotten odor that clung to everything and made eating almost impossible, even when you found something to eat. It mixed with the smoke from the few houses that still had fuel for fires, creating this horrible perfume that meant death and winter and hopelessness all at once. I started breathing through my mouth when I walked through certain parts of the village, but the taste of that smell would coat my tongue anyway, reminding me that I was living in the middle of a graveyard that used to be my home. We stopped mourning individually because there wasn't time or energy left for proper grief, and because crying for one person meant acknowledging that everyone around you was dying too. When old Petro Marchenko died in his sleep, his wife simply dragged his body outside and left it by the road like she was putting out trash for collection. I wanted to feel horrified by this, but instead, I felt envious that she still had the strength to move a full-grown man's body, and I started calculating whether I would be able to do the same thing when my time came to dispose of someone I loved. Children played around dead bodies because death had become their normal, and watching them skip rope next to corpses showed me how completely our world had been turned upside down. My neighbor's 7-year-old daughter used to pretend that the frozen bodies were sleeping people, and she would whisper to them and sometimes even pat their faces gently, like she was trying to wake them up for dinner. Her mother stopped correcting her after a while, maybe because the fantasy was kinder than the reality, or maybe because maintaining the illusion that death was just sleep helped the little girl process what was happening around her. Soviet authorities collected bodies like garbage loading them onto carts without ceremony or dignity, and the sound of those wooden wheels creaking through our streets became the soundtrack to our daily existence. The men who came to gather the dead never looked at faces, just grabbed arms and legs and tossed people into their wagons like they were clearing fallen branches after a storm. They worked fast and efficient, and I noticed they never spoke to each other while they loaded the bodies, like talking might remind them that these had been human beings instead of just problems to be solved. The fear of becoming one of those bodies yourself created a constant tension that made every interaction feel like it might be your last conversation with someone. I started studying people's faces when I talked to them, memorizing details in case I found them dead the next morning. And I caught other people doing the same thing to me. We all became experts at recognizing the signs that someone was close to death, the way their eyes started looking too big for their faces, how their skin took on a grayish color that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Witnessing mass death numbed us to individual tragedy in ways that made survival possible, but also made us less human than we had been before. Each body I stepped over represented not just one person's death, but the death of my ability to feel shocked or heartbroken by loss, until I became someone who could walk through a graveyard of neighbors without stopping to pray or cry or even acknowledge what I was seeing. But even after the dying stopped, even after the bodies were cleared from our streets and life began to resemble something normal again, we discovered that surviving the horror was only the first challenge we would face. The silence that followed. When the famine finally ended in 1934, the Soviet regime made it clear that discussing what had happened to us was forbidden, and this silence became a second prison that trapped us for decades. We couldn't talk about the bodies in the streets, the children who died begging for food, or the way our neighbors had turned against each other in desperation. The government called it a natural disaster, blamed it on bad weather and kulak resistance, and anyone who suggested otherwise risked imprisonment or worse. The psychological impact of carrying trauma in complete silence created wounds that never healed properly, festering inside us like infections that couldn't drain. I lived with the memory of my brother's death, the sound of his voice fading to nothing, the feeling of his body growing lighter in my arms, but I couldn't share these images with anyone. They stayed locked inside my head, playing on repeat during quiet moments, and without the ability to speak them out loud, they gained a power over me that felt almost supernatural. The trauma lived in my body like a second heartbeat, constant and irregular, reminding me every day of what I had witnessed and survived. Any mention of 1933 triggered a collective freeze and swift topic change, and this avoidance became as automatic as breathing. I watched my own family perfect this dance of deflection, and I became expert at recognizing the look that crossed people's faces when they accidentally stepped too close to forbidden memories. Their eyes would go blank for a moment, like they were looking at something far away, and then they would blink and start talking about something else entirely. The fear that talking about the Holodomor would bring punishment or make it happen again controlled our behavior in ways that outlasted Stalin himself. Even after he died, even after Khrushchev came to power and some things became safer to discuss, we couldn't shake the feeling that speaking about starvation might somehow invite it back into our lives. I caught myself whispering even when I was alone, as if the walls themselves might report what I was saying to authorities who could resurrect the famine as punishment for my honesty. This superstitious fear mixed with rational caution until I couldn't tell the difference between genuine danger and the phantom threats that lived in my traumatized mind. This silence created a second layer of trauma that was almost worse than the original starvation, because it meant we couldn't process what had happened to us. Without the ability to tell our stories, to share our grief, to explain our pain to others who might understand, the trauma stayed raw and unhealed inside us. I found myself having conversations with my dead brother in the middle of the night, whispering to him about things I couldn't say to living people. And these one-sided talks became the only way I could acknowledge what we had experienced together. Survivors exhibited avoidance behaviors consistent with PTSD, and our silence patterns became a documented trauma response that shaped entire families for generations. Children and grandchildren grew up not understanding their parents' behaviors, watching us hoard food and panic over empty cupboards without knowing why these things triggered such extreme reactions. My daughter would find me crying over a piece of moldy bread that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. And when she asked what was wrong, I would make up stories about being tired or worried about work. She learned to navigate around my inexplicable fears and obsessions without ever understanding their source, and I watched her develop her own anxiety in response to my unspoken trauma. The silence created a gap between generations that felt impossible to bridge. The enforced silence became a survival mechanism that outlasted the famine itself, protecting us from external punishment but trapping us in internal isolation. We learned to carry our pain alone, to process our grief in private, to live with the constant weight of unspeakable memories. This isolation became so normal that even when it was safe to speak, we had forgotten how to share our experiences with others. The silence had become part of our identity, woven into who we were as deeply as the trauma itself. I started to understand that silence was another form of control, another way Stalin continued to torture us long after the last body had been buried. By making our experiences unspeakable, he ensured that we would continue to suffer in isolation, that our trauma would eat us alive from the inside, that we would never be able to fully heal or help each other recover. The first time I spoke my brother's name aloud after 30 years of silence happened on a Tuesday morning in 1963, when I was hanging laundry and suddenly heard myself say, "Petro," into the empty air. The sound of his name in my voice felt like breaking a physical barrier, and I stood there crying and repeating his name until the word became just sound. But even that small act of speaking felt like a revolution, like I was reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. Breaking that silence became its own form of survival, a way to honor the dead and heal the living by refusing to let our stories disappear. If you're moved by this story, share it, so their silence can finally end. But surviving the horror and breaking the silence were only part of what the Holodomor took from us, because the deepest changes happened inside our souls, in places that never fully recovered. How survival changes your soul. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but they never mention what it takes away. When I survived the Holodomor, I thought the worst was over, but I discovered that living through hell changes you in ways that never heal. The person who walked out of that famine wasn't the same woman who had entered it. And the changes went deeper than physical scars or traumatic memories. My entire relationship with the world had been rewired, like my brain had been taken apart and put back together with different instructions for how to exist. The obsessive food hoarding started immediately after the famine ended and never stopped, becoming as automatic as breathing and just as necessary for my survival. I began hiding food in places throughout my house that made no logical sense. Inside pillowcase seams, buried in the garden, wrapped in cloth and stuffed behind loose floorboards. Even when stores had plenty of bread and my cupboards were full, I couldn't stop myself from buying extra portions and secreting them away like a squirrel preparing for winter. My daughter would find moldy cheese hidden in my bedroom drawers years later and ask why I kept spoiled food, but I couldn't explain that throwing away anything edible felt like committing murder, like betraying everyone who had died hungry. This behavior matched what researchers documented among descendants who hide spoiled food, carrying forward survival instincts they never directly experienced. I could never again take a meal for granted, and this reverence for food transformed every eating experience into something almost religious. When I sat down to dinner, I would touch each piece of bread before eating it, feeling its weight and texture, reminding myself that this was real food and not another cruel dream. I developed rituals around meals that my family found strange. I had to eat everything on my plate in a specific order, saving the best bite for last, and I would chew each mouthful slowly enough to taste every grain and fiber. Wasting food became physically impossible for me, and I would finish other people's leftovers rather than see them thrown away, even when I was already full enough to feel sick. The hypervigilance never left me, and I spent the rest of my life constantly checking food supplies and calculating how long we could survive if everything disappeared again tomorrow. I would count the loaves of bread in my kitchen multiple times each day, making mental inventories of every can and jar like I was preparing for siege warfare. This constant state of alert exhaustion meant I never fully relaxed, even during celebrations or holidays, because part of my mind was always monitoring our food security and planning for the next catastrophe. The emotional numbness that had protected me during the worst moments of starvation became permanent, shielding me from pain, but also preventing me from experiencing joy or connection with the intensity that normal people took for granted. I could watch beautiful sunsets or hear my grandchildren laughing without feeling the full emotional impact of these experiences, like there was a thick glass wall between me and the world that muffled everything good along with everything bad. This numbness helped me function day to day, but it also meant that life felt flat and distant most of the time, like I was watching someone else's existence instead of living my own. Survival mode became my permanent state of being, and I couldn't turn off the mental calculations and emergency planning that had kept me alive during the famine. I found myself constantly evaluating escape routes from buildings, assessing which neighbors might help in a crisis, and maintaining relationships based on their potential usefulness rather than genuine affection. This utilitarian approach to human connection served me well during dangerous times, but it also meant I struggled to form the kind of deep bonds that make life meaningful, because part of me was always preparing for the moment when everyone would abandon each other again. The cost of surviving when others didn't created a guilt that ate at me like acid, making me question whether I deserved the life I had managed to keep. I carried the faces of dead neighbors with me everywhere, and sometimes I would find myself apologizing to them silently for still being alive when they weren't. This survivor's guilt mixed with the hypervigilance and numbness to create a toxic emotional cocktail that made normal happiness feel like betrayal of the dead. These survival instincts passed down through generations like inherited diseases, and I watched my children develop anxieties and behaviors that mirrored my own, carrying forward trauma they had never directly experienced. The Holodomor didn't just change me, it rewired my family's DNA, creating patterns that would echo through decades of mornings when simple acts like checking for bread became rituals of survival. Now, 70 years later, I still wake up some mornings and check if there's bread in the kitchen because the Holodomor taught me that your next meal is never guaranteed. The sound of "Mama, I want to eat" echoes not just in my memory, but in the way I raised my children, always making sure they never went to bed hungry. 18 countries now recognize the Holodomor as genocide, yet its lessons remain vital as we face a world where hunger still exists and truth still gets buried under political convenience. Stalin wanted to kill our bodies, but the real victory was that he couldn't kill our story. And now, you know why we can never let the world forget what happened to us in Ukraine during those terrible years. Remember, every crumb we share honors those who starved. Tell this story so their voices live on.